Okay, so we've looked at the goals of punishment. Now let's move on to take a look at sentencing model. So in the United States, those convicted of crimes are sentenced by two models. One of the models is known as the Indeterminate Sentence sentencing model, and the other is a Determinant Sentencing model. And I'm just going to put all this up here and then we'll talk about it. The models that are used are determined by law. And so whether or not your state uses an indeterminate or determinate sentencing model, that's going to be defined in state law. And the same with federal government, whether they use a determinate or indeterminate sentencing model, that's going to be determined by federal law. So the Wisconsin uses the determinant model. We'll talk about what the difference is in a second. 34 states, so Wisconsin's a little bit out of the norm. 34 states use the indeterminate model, and the federal government uses an indeterminate model as well. And so just thinking about it, like just in general, the definition and the difference between an indeterminate sentencing model and a determinate sentencing model is whether or not the sentence is known and defined or whether it is undefined, okay? So if you use an indeterminate sentencing model, sort of think about if I asked you the question, hey, what are you doing this weekend? And you said, oh, I don't know. I might go see a movie or I might go see a concert. Well, then your plans for the weekend are indeterminate. They have not yet been decided or determined, okay? And so an indeterminate sentence is a sentence that's undefined. The sentence is not exactly known. So it would be along the lines of you've been sentenced to 2 to 5 years in the state penitentiary. We know that it's not going to be any less than 2. We know it's not going to be any less than 5, but we don't know exactly whether it's going to be closer to 5 or closer to 2. That's an indeterminate sentence. A determinate sentence is if I asked you the question, hey, what are you doing this weekend? And you said, I'm going to a Brewers game, then that it's determined. We know what you're doing this weekend, okay? That's what a determinate sentence is. It's established, it's known, it's defined, okay? And so that if you're sentenced, if you're living in a state like Wisconsin that has truth in sentencing, we use the determinate sentencing model, that when you are sentenced, that you are sentenced to 15 years or 17 years or 2 years, okay? And for the most part, you serve at least 85% of that sentence. It's determined, okay? So let's look at the pros and cons associated with each of these sentencing models. Okay, so let's look at indeterminate sentencing model in a little bit more detail. So as I stated on the last slide, the indeterminate sentencing model is a sentence that's undefined but within a particular range. So for example, a person is sentenced to secure confinement in a prison for no less than 5 years, but not to exceed 15 years. So within a range of 5 to 15. And there are certain things that can reduce to get you closer to 5 years, okay? Or if you don't do these things, then your sentence is going to be closer to 15 years. So states that use the indeterminate sentencing will have a good time earned. And so you can reduce your sentence for good behavior, for engaging in certain sort of rehabilitation or vocational skills. All of this can be sort of used as a means to get you to the lower end of your sentence. But if you get in trouble in prison, if you aren't doing any rehabilitation or vocational skills, and you're put in solitary confinement a lot, that's going to make it. Chances are you're going to end up serving your entire sentence of 15 years. Now, the goals are probably pretty straightforward. The goals are that offenders are placed in confinement only until they are rehabilitated and then released out on parole, right? So the thinking is it's going to take you at least 5 years to get rehabilitated enough to get back into society. But then within 5 and 15 years, if you're demonstrating that you've learned from your mistakes and that you're engaging in good behavior, then the state can feel better about reintegrating you into society. And so there are incentives for good behavior and rehabilitation. Maybe what is so in a way that's an upside of an indeterminate sentence, right? You want people who are confined to engage in good behavior and to avail themselves to rehabilitation and skills, because that's going to make them like better able to reintegrate into society. The downside of it is that, or downside upside, but a lot of people see it as a downside, is that it's the role of correctional agents and parole boards. And so correctional agents within a prison can write some people up more than others, could turn the other, the cheek, particularly if there's like a quid pro quo going on between the correctional agent and the person who's confined. And so in a way, the correctional agent and the parole board play a role in determining how long your sentence is going to be. And since judges are the ones who sentence, and there might be bias that could be involved in the determining of good time or not good time, that there's a potential for bias there. Also that, your textbook talks about the lack of clarity in terms of why parole is denied. So you might be following all of the rules and then going before the parole board and they're still denying you and continue to deny you. And that can lead to inmate frustration. They're doing all the right things, yet they're not getting rewarded for it. And it might seem sort of random in terms of who gets parole and who doesn't. And so those are some of the downsides or the drawbacks of the indeterminate sentence. Okay, so as we know, the determinant sentence is a fixed term of years to be served by the offender. So for example, that a person would be sentenced to secure confinement in prison for 15 years. And so there's no range there. It's defined and it's determined how long you are going to stay there. And Wisconsin, as of 2000, has what's known as truth in sentencing. And what that means is that in general, felons are required to serve the entire length of their bifurcated sentence, right? And so that usually in Wisconsin that you'll be sentenced to a certain portion of incarceration and then extended supervision outside of prison after that. And that the thinking is that felons for the most part serve all of the portion of their sentence. On the upside that it's an equal justice, right? I mean, it's sort of like that if you have in the indeterminate sentence, it's 5 to 15, you could have two people who actually have committed the same crime, but that, first degree manslaughter. And one person, behaves in prison and they get out in 6 years, and the other person doesn't behave and they get out in 14 or 15 years. Could look at that from a victim's perspective and you could say, well, that's not really fair because this person engaged in manslaughter and they should just get a punishment for what they did. It shouldn't be based on how well they behave in prison. Another upside of the determinant sentencing model is that the victim in the community knows the length of the sentence, right? And so if somebody is sentenced to something indeterminate from the victim's perspective, they don't know when that person or the community or the victim themselves or the victim's family, they don't know when that person's going to be released, right? And so, which can add to a sense of anxiety. And then, a downside of it is too that there's really no incentive for good behavior to behave yourself in prison or engage in rehabilitation programs. So what's the incentive? If you're in prison, you're going to be there for 15 years. What's the incentive to behave, right? I mean, you're going to have to serve for 15 years. Unlike the indeterminate sentencing, where there's actually an incentive for behavior and availing yourself to rehabilitation, that does not exist as much with the determinant sentencing. Okay, so thinking about the sentencing models, which do you think is a better model? Do you think the indeterminate or the determinant sentencing model is better? Let's say if you committed a crime and you were sentenced, would you prefer an indeterminate sentence or a determinate sentence? I think if I were convicted of a crime, hopefully that wouldn't ever happen because I don't think I'd do real good in prison. Although I'm smart, so maybe I could trade in on my smarts, right? But I'm kind of like a cripple. I mean, I have mobility issues, and so I think I'd be preyed upon in prison. But maybe they'd respect me because I was smart. But anyways, enough about me. So which would I prefer? I think that I would prefer the indeterminate sentence because I feel like I could follow the rules and it would be a motivator for good behavior. Although I would get really pissed off if I followed the rules and I wasn't rewarded for them. So in a way, if it's indeterminate, I'd like there to be like a set due process, like a rules that if you do X, you will get Y. And so maybe in a way, determinant would be better because it's like I wouldn't get my hopes up and get really disappointed if I was not released early. Let's say if you were a victim of a crime, which would you prefer? What kind of sentencing model would you prefer for your offender? I think personally for me, I think I would probably prefer a determinant sentence for my offender, particularly if it was a violent crime, a personal crime against me. I'd really want to know when they were getting out. The flip side of that, I also do believe in the capacity for rehabilitation and restorative justice. And so I do think that people have the capacity to change. And so I'd like them to exercise that capacity with an indeterminate sentence. If they can prove that they can better themselves, they think that they should be rewarded for that. So there's no right answer. You can sort of think about that on your own, what you would prefer. And then also if the goal of sentencing is fill in the blank, which model do you think would come closer to achieving that goal? So let's say if the goal of sentencing was to incapacitate somebody, keep a dangerous person out of society. I think for me, I would think that would maybe be the indeterminate model, that if the goal is to keep harmful people out of society, unless you think, it's possible that somebody is incapable of not engaging in harm. And I think that would become self-evident during your incarceration, right? If you can't not harm people, you're going to harm your other inmates, and then you're not going to get out. You're going to serve your full sentence. If the goal of incapacitation is that if you're not harmful, you get to come back, well then indeterminate sentence would help us achieve that goal, potentially. General deterrence, I'd have to go with determinant sentencing, right? If you're going to send a message to others, if you do this is what's going to happen to you. An indeterminate sentence could open it up to say the message that is sent is anywhere between 5 and 15. You might roll the dice and say, I'll take my chances. If I get caught, 5 to 15, and I can do 5 years, right? Something along those lines. So anyways, just get, why am I talking about this? The point is because the goal of sentencing, that could, whatever your goal is in terms of punishment and sentencing, that the model that you use might be different. It might be, in some cases, determinant or indeterminate. Okay, so person's been convicted. They're going to be sentenced. We have a sentencing model, depending on what state you live in. We know what the goals of sentencing are. But what are some of the factors that can affect sentencing above and beyond the goals that you want to achieve with that sentence? So one factor that affects sentencing are the sentencing guidelines. And so you'll read about those in the textbook. Both the state and federal government have sentencing guidelines. And so if you look in Wisconsin state law and you Google Wisconsin state sentencing guidelines, there are worksheets that both the prosecutor and the defense attorney work through in terms of trying to figure out what the appropriate sentence is. And so that while sentencing guidelines are not necessarily binding to the judge, that we do use sentencing guidelines to get a sense of what sentence that person should receive. And so sentencing guidelines are basically the standards that define the parameters of sentencing decisions, and those are embedded in state law. And so one factor that affects sentencing are sentencing guidelines. Another thing that affects sentencing are certain factors that the judge can take into consideration. And these factors are also, kind of built into sentencing guidelines, and they're also going to be components of what the prosecutor and the defense attorney, they'll make cases for what they think the appropriate sentence is. And these are some of the factors that they are allowed to take into consideration. And so the more severe the offense is, the tougher the sentence is going to be. So if you have guidelines and it ranges between, on the low end, the guideline is 5, and in the high end, it's 20. The more severe the offense is, the longer the sentence is likely to be. Whether or not the offender has a prior criminal record. If you do, that can be taken into consideration to get on the higher end of the sentencing guideline. Whether or not the offender used violence, okay, so you might be, the type of violence that was used in the offense can affect the sentence that somebody receives. whether or not the offender used weapons, whether or not the crime was committed for money. These are all the types of, this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are the types of factors that a sentencing judge and a prosecutor and a defense attorney will take into consideration as they are making sentencing recommendations. Judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and obviously the sentencing guidelines of the state cannot consider race, gender when sentencing. So obviously you can't say, I'm giving you a tougher sentence because you're black, or I'm giving you a lighter sentence because you're a woman. And so overt racism, overt classism, overt sexism, that is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. However, as we know, there is evidence of racial bias in prosecutorial discretion in charging, and that can also impact the sentence. There's also evidence of racial bias in sentencing themselves. Okay, and so even though overtly you can't engage in any overt racism or sexism, that implicit bias can work its way in, and that when you compare the sentences that African Americans get for the same sentence that a white American gets, you can see that there is a difference that is not accounted for. Okay, so what about Kim Potter? What sentence did she receive, and do you think it was the correct sentence? Well, on February 18th of 2022, as many of you know, Potter was sentenced to 2 years in state custody, 16 months in prison, and then the rest of the sentence will be meted out in a supervised release. Okay, so if 2 years or 24 months, then 16 in prison and the rest in supervised release. Now, this is well below the 7-year guideline. So when you look at the Minnesota guideline based on the factors of her offense, that she should have received somewhere in the ballpark of 7 years. And so she received 2, well under what the sentencing guideline is. So it's below the sentencing guideline. It is a determinant sentence because it's 24 months, 16 behind bars, and the rest in supervised release. So it's not an indeterminate sentence. So what were some of the factors that the judge considered when going below the 7-year recommendation from Minnesota law? The judge was clear about it in the sentencing hearing, that they basically said that Ms. Potter intended to pull her taser. She never intended to pull her gun, and so it was an error on her part. That the judge felt that the scene was really chaotic after being pulled over. What ensued was really chaotic, which might have contributed to Ms. Potter's pulling her gun rather than her taser. And that she said that there was no personal animosity towards Wright. That, as she said in her sentencing, at the sentencing hearing, she basically said that this was a tragic, tragic mistake. And that is what justified the 2 years. So what do you think? Is this the correct sentence? Do you feel like she should have been incarcerated at all? If you feel like this really was an error, a tragic accident, did she deserve to be put behind bars for that? As the family of the victim suggested after the hearing, they said that this was a completely inappropriate sentence, that she should have gotten at least 7 years. So what do you think? Is it the correct sentence? And what goals do you think this sentence is trying to achieve? Is it trying to send a message to other cops? Well, maybe not, but it was less than the recommended sentence. But giving her some time behind bars could be sort of just desserts, because she is going to be incarcerated for not an insignificant period of time. Think about the other goals that we've learned about in this lecture as you're sort of trying to answer that question. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. What you've learned in this lecture, though, you have an opportunity to apply what you've learned in our final exam. And so on the final exam, there's going to be a question that gives you a scenario, and you're going to act like the sentencing judge, and that you're going to explain the sentence that you give, the intended goals, whether you would use an indeterminate or determinant sentencing, and also what factors you took into consideration. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Thanks for listening, and the next lecture is about the death penalty.